This is a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
This podcast was recorded on Thursday, and just as we were about to publish, we got news that top trade negotiators from the United States and China had a call on Friday, their first such discussion during the pandemic. This came days after Donald Trump threatened to scrap the trade deal, and what we know right now is that China is under huge pressure to increase its US imports, which, as we've discussed on this week's show, are actually falling. But we will be back next week with full analysis of this call and everything that happens in between now and then. We're also in the process of trying to secure a really interesting interview from somebody who has been involved in the talks from the outset. We hope to bring you that next week. Have a great one.
Hello and welcome to the US-China Trade War podcast with me, Finbarr Bermingham, on the political economy desk here at the South China Morning Post. I am talking to you from Hong Kong, where this week things are most definitely looking up. We've had 0 community infections over the past fortnight and just a few new cases of coronavirus of any kind. The government is loosening social distancing rules and there's an air of normality returning to the city. I truly hope that wherever you're listening, you'll find yourself in a similar situation in the not so distant future. Today we saw China's trade data for April, and at least in one way it was surprisingly good. John Carter and Zhou Xin, political economy editors, will be on the podcast to discuss whether strong export growth, even as the rest of the world is shutting down, is sustainable, and we'll also discuss why imports are taking a battering. I've been working with Cissy Zhou this week, my colleague on the political economy desk. This week we were speaking to people in China and the United States about what has been an absolute capsizing of superpower relations. The term New Cold War has been popping up in the talk about US-China relations for some time now, but these days it seems it's actually becoming a reality. Even people connected to the Chinese government are using the term. So we'll be getting the inside line from Cissy about how this very worrying time is being viewed among those people in China. On with the show. Joined as usual by John Carter and Zhou Xin, political economy editors here at the South China Morning Post. We're recording this on Thursday, and this morning we had April's trade figures released from China. The Customs Authority put them out on Thursday morning. What they showed was a bit of a surprise, a 3.5% rise in exports in April, which caught everybody off guard because most of China's export markets had been shut down over the course of that month. John Carter, I'm going to bring you in here just to explain a little bit about why everybody was so flummoxed by this and where indeed was that export growth coming from.
Well, analysts expected a large decline in exports in April. The one survey had a expected decline of 11%. Because of the sharp deterioration in the economies of the European Union and the United States, because the pandemic is just now starting to hit those economies. And that didn't transpire, at least not in April. Exports were up 3.5%. Because of a combination of things. One is the sharp increase of exports of medical equipment, personal protection equipment for fighting the coronavirus. That's one thing. The other thing is and this is a theory because we don't have full details of the data yet, things that were made in March and early April were shipped out in April, catching up with old orders, if you will, and that helped boost exports in April. But there is a absolute consensus that this will not continue because of the sharp decline in the U.S. and EU economies that started in the second quarter and is expected to worsen as months go on. It will really cut into Chinese exports in the months ahead.
Yes, and Zhou Xin, this is something interestingly that over the course of the past few months, when we hear statements from various government ministries in China, they have actually been warning quite vocally and publicly about how the slowdown and the shutdown overseas will really hit China's exports. What's the sense within China? Are they sort of braced for a major impact, and what sort of things can they do to maybe try and soften that blow? Is there anything at all?
I think the Chinese government has been, facing this reality they know they cannot rely on exports to drive growth anymore. So the focus has been shifted to domestic job market stability to ensure people's basic living instead of having more exports to drive the economic growth. But there's one point that the leadership has made it very clear that China wants to keep its position in the global value chain. They want to keep China relevant to the future world economy as much as possible. But for now, especially for the coming months, I think it's kind of well accepted that China has to face a tough export outlook in 2020, and that's something that the Chinese government has been preparing for.
Imports also today down 14.2%. And Zhou Xin, on your point there that China is going to have to rely on the domestic economy to power the recovery from this slowdown, what does that lower than expected import figure say about China's efforts to sort of bolster its domestic economy? Does that put a question mark beside demand among Chinese consumers?
Well, I haven't seen the details breakdown, but the fall in imports usually lead to fall in exports a few months down the road. Because, a big part of China's trade is so-called processing trade. China imports components and to make them into finished products as they may. This a big drop in imports means China is importing fewer components from other countries, which means in a few months' time, maybe China don't have so much to export. And also we have some anecdotal evidence to show that the disrupted supply chain in overseas. They can't ship the necessary components to China, or some ships cannot move, some planes are grounded. So Chinese factories can't make, full schedule, even they have the people, they have the facility, but, they're lacking of the materials from other countries. So I think that can partly explain the drop in imports. And also we can see this is kind of a global disrupted value chain.
John, when you look at those import figures, is there anything that immediately springs to mind?
Well, it's the sharp decline in oil prices. The import figures are in yuan or US dollar terms, so it's the value of those imports. So if the price drops sharply, then the value of your imports also drops sharply. And as we've seen, because of the sharp decline in demand for oil and oil products because of the impact of the coronavirus, this has led to a sharp decline in oil prices globally. And this may be one of the reasons behind the sharp decline in imports in April.
Another piece of data which came out this week from Washington was the US trade numbers. And they showed that even though China is supposed to be rapidly increasing its imports, its purchases of American goods, the figures are nowhere near where you would expect them to be. China is buying far fewer US products than it was in 2017, which is, of course, the baseline on which the US-China trade deal, the Phase 1 trade deal, is based. Zhou Xin, is there any optimism at all at this stage, less than 5 months after the signing of this agreement, that China will be able to keep up to its purchases agreements?
Well, Finbarr, for now, it seems very highly unlikely that China is going to do this because, even a few months ago, there's already Chinese government researchers saying China should cite the act of God, just citing the coronavirus to say that, we tried to buy more from you, but really, demand has disappeared because of the coronavirus, and you can't blame us for that. And it's quite clear for many of the products China has promised to buy. For instance, China wants more pork, China wants more soybean, but because of the disrupted transport and because of disrupted production in the US, China really cannot import as much as it wants. And for the oil, when China and the US signed the deal, the oil was like $40 or $50 per barrel, but now it's like $20 per barrel, and it's very difficult for China to make that gap. And also, as we reported, one executive at the Chinese oil company is saying, look, we really want to buy more U.S. crude oil, but, the demand has disappeared, and there's so much supplies from the Middle East. There's no market basis for China to buy a lot of crude oil from the U.S. Right now. By the way, also, the transport cost from U.S. to China is usually at $10 per barrel for the crude oil. And by importing from Middle East, the cost can be half of that. And a few bucks really matters when the crude oil price is so low now. So I don't see any likelihood that China can buy as much as possible and then fulfill its promises.
And this is something I'm going to be talking with Cissy later on the podcast this week about, Cissy Zhou. But John, the mood music has really taken a dark turn this week, right? Like in terms of the rhetoric from both sides has really sharpened over the past couple of weeks.
It has, and it's starting to frighten people. And as you yourself reported, increasing talk of a new Cold War. And in some cases, some people are talking a potential for armed conflict. It's scary, to tell you the truth. And President Trump and his administration seem to want to blame China for the coronavirus and are pulling out all the stops without presenting any evidence for their theories that the virus escaped from a lab in Wuhan in China, which was the epicenter of the outbreak in China. And there is talk of the need for China to compensate the U.S. financially in some respect. And the mood in Washington seems to be to outdo one another, to come up with ways to get China to pay for all of this. And China is not going to have any of that. And it's going to lead to a sharp deterioration in relations, and it may end up killing the Phase 1 trade deal. And Trump himself has said this week that if the Chinese don't buy what they've promised to buy in the Phase 1 trade deal, he'll simply cancel it. So it's a question of, does China cancel it first or the U.S. cancel it first? But it seems to be moving in that direction.
It's a different kind of brinkmanship. And Zhou Xin, one of the stories that one of our colleagues, Karen Young, wrote this week was about China perhaps ditching its U.S. treasuries. Now, this is something which sort of rears its head every so often, and it's always a bit of a heated debate. So we can tell by the amount of people that read and comment on these stories that they're very, very sort of controversial. Just really briefly, Zhou Xin, talk about like what's going on there. Is this a realistic prospect, and explain what exactly would happen in such a situation?
Well, for now, I think it's still highly unlikely that China will do this. But there are debates, at least within Beijing, that maybe if the U.S. threatens to confiscate China's assets in the United States, why China will put their assets there to be confiscated by the United States? And also, if we have a little bit of historical perspective, we can see in the last decade, what China has been doing is to cutting its reliance on the US Treasury. So it has been diversifying. In 2009, to create the China Investment Corp, which do alternative investments and investment in stocks. The SAFE has creating its different vehicles to do, buying anything but the US government treasuries. And also, the SAFE has created this co-financing unit, which is basically providing foreign exchange capital to institutions like China Development Bank and financing projects around the Belt and Road Initiative. And also, even hard numbers published by the SAFE last year in the annual book, saying the percentage of the US dollar denominated assets, the percentage has dropped from nearly 80% to 55% in just a 5-year time. So I think China has a reason to cut its holdings of US Treasuries. Because as we all know, the yield on the US Treasury is getting lower and lower. So the investment return is not there. And B, increasingly, China knows that U.S. Treasury used to be the last kind of resort. It's the most liquid assets. It offered kind of a security. But increasingly, China don't see its economic security, putting the stakes on the holdings of the U.S. Treasuries.
And this is seen as the word that I always see associated with these stories in this debate is weaponization, John. China weaponizes its, dollar holdings and its treasuries and investments. Do you see it as a sort of a weapon? The fact that China would dump these, or do you see it as Zhou Xin suggested, there maybe more of an economic reality?
Weaponizing their U.S. dollar holdings would effectively be an act of war. Now, we may be headed that way, but it would be an extreme measure. It's considered the nuclear option because China if it were to try to rapidly sell off its more than $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, it would crash the market, and it would hurt itself as much as anybody else. So to do this is like a suicide bomber. You achieve your objective, but you destroy yourself. So that's an act of war, and that's why it's highly unlikely it would happen. But these are unprecedented times, so you can never say never.
Yeah, and in this new Cold War, maybe this is a new form of mutually assured destruction away from actual nuclear warfare.
Yeah. And I also said it's unlikely to happen because I mentioned the historical experiments by China to diversify away from the US treasuries. And most of these experiments are not quite successful. For instance, if you buy a lot of property in London when the property prices are at their peak, you don't have lots of good returns. Or if you spend the money on oil projects along the Belt and Road initiative, and the returns are not as good as the US government treasuries. So, and also for kind of day-to-day management, I think the whole structure is basically suited more for investment in US treasuries rather than for alternative investments like gold.
Okay, very interesting discussion. John Carter, Zhou Xin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Finbarr.
I'm joined on the line by Cissy Zhou, my colleague on the political economy desk. Cissy and I have been working on a joint story this week, which really illustrates the deterioration in US-China relations since the coronavirus outbreak began. Cissy, this week we saw US President Donald Trump threatening to scrap the Phase 1 trade deal in response for China not meeting its trade purchases, the purchase agreement element of the trade deal, but also it seems to be a reflection of the growing antagonism on both sides. Things have really taken a sharp turn over the past few weeks. Now, you've been speaking with people inside China, connected with the Chinese government. Give us an idea from your side what people are seeing as the major events in this decline in the relationship, and also what are they saying in general about the superpower rivalry this week?
So there have been events from both sides. So despite Trump has threatened to terminate the Phase 1 trade deal and increase tariffs on China, as you have just mentioned, both Trump and Pompeo have claimed that they have seen evidence that the coronavirus was leaked from laboratory in China. And it's also reported that the Trump administration is pushing manufacturing supply chains out of China. Meanwhile, in China, the state media and Chinese diplomats have rushed up attacks on U.S. politicians on social media. For example, state media, including Xinhua and People's Daily, they have released a video mocking America's handling of the coronavirus. Chinese foreign spokesperson have kept saying that the virus was originated in the U.S., etc. And I have talked to some of the Chinese experts who are advisors to the Chinese government. And the Chinese experts all agreed that the current bilateral relationship between the US and China has been the worst in decades. Some say it is a new Cold War. Some say it is not a new Cold War yet. But the relationship is at least as bad as after the 1989 Tiananmen protest. Some even said it is much worse than the post-Tiananmen relationship.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting comparison because I think after Tiananmen we saw the United States issue sanctions on China for what it perceived to be a human rights crackdown, and now there are people who were former officials in the Trump administration that I was speaking to this week encouraging the US to pursue sanctions instead of tariffs, targeted sanctions on individuals in China for what they perceive to be either a role in covering up China's role in the virus and also hoarding of medical supplies, of PPE. And that's a real sort of another bone of contention is China having the dominance of that medical supplies market when the rest of the world needs it. Cissy, are you surprised to see quite usually conservative figures in China, that you speak to probably quite regularly, and they don't usually say inflammatory things, but now they're comparing it to a new Cold War, to Tiananmen. Is that a surprise to you?
not that surprised. I am a little bit surprised because, even 3 weeks ago, if you ask those Chinese experts about the US-China relationship, most of them would emphasize how important it is for the two countries to work together to fight against the coronavirus. But now it sounds like they are really worried about the bilateral relationship between the two countries because it's quite obvious that the US-China relationship is no longer the same as that of a few years ago, or even the same as that of a few months ago.
Yeah, a few months ago, I think people were quite hopeful that at least the trade deal and the trade negotiations and the fact that they'd signed the Phase 1 trade deal would mean that the two sides would keep in talks, they would keep the relationship in some way friendly. Do you get a sense now that any optimism that came when the trade deal was signed in January has since disappeared?
In the past, that the US side would always distinguish the CCP from Chinese people. But this time it's a little bit different because recently it is a Pew survey which shows that 66% of Americans held an unfavorable view of China, not only the Chinese authority, but the Chinese people as a whole. But now we have to put a question mark on this. Even for the U.S. business community, some of them used to tell me that the disputes were just between government and government, and those businessmen, they still want to do business with Chinese people, and they had hoped that things might change if Trump loses election this year. But now we really should put a question mark on this.
And is there expectation that Trump within China, because I think it's in the US, election fever will really start kicking in over the next few months. Do you think that your contacts in China are watching this closely? Have you had any conversations with people in China about whether they want 4 more years of Trump or whether they would prefer to deal with a different president? What's your sense on that regard?
I think the general view is that even if Democratic candidates gets elected, they will still be pretty tough on China. But if Trump gets reelected, he is so unpredictable and things might get worse.
So, Cissy, when you say that Trump's unpredictable, we know this. And an active discussion over the past couple of years has been decoupling, something which Trump, as you mentioned, is forcing at the moment. He's trying to force US companies and their supply chains out of China. Do you think when you speak to these Chinese experts, this is one of their real fears? What sort of things are they worried about, and what are they specifically saying about the US-China relationship here?
There's no question about the decoupling because it is already happening. The question is how far the decoupling will go, because it looks impossible that 100% decoupling would happen because the world is totally different than the decoupling between US and the Soviet Union. And, people, there's still, some of the business activity and cultural exchange are still necessary for US and China. But in the future, if the decoupling deepens in the future, this kind of, cultural communication and business activity will definitely decrease.
Interesting you make that comparison. Obviously, the original Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union, the United States won that. It eventually led to the demise of the Soviet Union. So this was one of the reasons when we were speaking earlier in the week, and you had said that, yes, some of your contacts in China had, close to the Chinese government, had confirmed that they see this as a new Cold War. I thought that was very interesting because in a sense, it's sort of comparing China's situation to that of the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right?
Yeah. So, for example, Shi Yanhong, an international relations professor at Birmingham University, who is also an advisor to China's State Council, he told me that the United States and China are actually in the era of a new Cold War. He emphasized the adjective new because he thinks that this is different from the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. The new Cold War between the US and China features full competition and a rapid decoupling. He said that there's already been 30% of the decoupling. happened between US and China. He also thinks that the US-China relationship is no longer the same as that of a few years ago, and not even the same as that of a few months ago.
And this is a guy that I know you speak to fairly regularly. Have you noticed over the past months or even the past year a distinct change in his tone with regard to the US-China relationship?
Yeah, I think he was... He used to be quite optimistic about the US-China relationship. And he also thinks, in this critical age, how important it is for US and China to cooperate in fighting against the virus. But now because, the unpredictability of the Trump administration, and also given, Trump has to play the China card to win the upcoming election. And it sounds like he's getting really worried. He's no longer as optimistic as he used to be.
You, Cissy, spent a few months in the US over the winter. I think you went over there in November, December, and you just returned because of the virus. You left a little bit early. But, as a Chinese journalist in Washington, D.C., tell us a bit about, what was your sense of how things had changed with regard how China was being viewed, about people's discussions around China in Washington. Did you have any sense that there was a real deterioration there?
Yeah. First of all, on the government advisor level, all the think tanks that I talked to, they were pretty worried. When foreign spokeswoman Hua Chunying in late January or early February said that the U.S. was too unkind in responding to what was happening in China. And then afterwards, other spokespersons started to criticize U.S. Some even, called it the Trump virus. So they were really worried about the rhetoric from the spokespersons from the foreign ministry. And they think that these kind of comments will only deteriorate the bilateral relationship. It doesn't help at all. And they also told me that they pretty sure that the Trump administration will definitely revenge or retaliate on this kind of comments.
Really interesting there. Cissy, thanks so much for joining us today and have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this week's US-China Trade War podcast with me, Finbarr Bermingham. You can follow us on Twitter at SCMP Economy. I am at FBirmingham. That's Birmingham, BER, not like the city. Don't forget to check in on scmp.com for updates on trade wars, on coronavirus, and on anything related to the Chinese economy. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this podcast if you have enjoyed it. And we look forward to speaking with you again next week.
For more podcasts from the South China Morning Post, head to scmp.com, where you can hear more about technology, trade, culture, and society.